Okay, confession time here. I obviously love the process of chip carving, but I really dislike the process of finishing. Once I'm done carving the project, I really wish I could just be done and ship it off. Um, Dealing with the finishing process and the products and the time and all that stuff is not enjoyable for me. But that's why the tips in this lesson in this video are really born out of lessons learned the hard way on my part over the years as I've been carving and dealing with finishing and figuring out what that all looks like. So the main tip, I'm going to kind of have three parts to this. The main one is to really put the same attention, care, detail into the finishing process as you do to the chip carving. And it's, I don't want to exaggerate it too much, but it's not too hard for a poor finish to at least detract from, if not potentially ruin or really diminish a good chip carving project. So all of the patience and time and attention to detail and awareness of what you're doing and not cutting corners, all those sorts of things you want to apply to the finishing process after you're done carving. And so part of that, years ago when I started, I have another video that goes into more detail about my finishing process that I will link, but all of these tips are kind of related to my specific process, which is using sanding sealer first, applying that, let that dry, and then usually putting a stain on top of that. And so when I first started, I would just kind of take a nice big brush and get it all saturated with sanding sealer and slop it all on there front and back, make sure it was fully coated, and called it good. Well, found out over time that turns out you ideally want a more even coat of sanding sealer. I kind of figured once it goes into the grain and it was absorbed, then it doesn't really matter how much is in there, it's going to be the same on the surface, but I found that wasn't really the case. And so areas where I had more sanding sealer versus less sanding sealer had a different response to the stain, and especially on areas of overlap that I might brush a whole bunch on here and it'll kind of come down the side here, and that's fine. Then after I'm done doing the whole surface, then I'll come around and do this and just slather a bunch of sealer on there, and I get some overlapping with what dripped down and kind of same along the edge here. And I figured I could sand that out, and again, that's not really how it worked. When I had the overlap, it would create almost a seam. You kind of have a line following where that overlap was that I wasn't really ever able to get out with sanding, and it would show through in the stain, and I was never happy with that. And so the first aspect of this, as I said, is to try to get an even, consistent coat of sanding sealer if you're using that on the whole project, and being aware of areas where different faces overlap, trying not to let it drip down or leak on either edge. Just, in this situation, just do the top, be careful around the edge, don't have so much that it's pooling and dripping down, and then once I'm done with the top surface, then I come to the side, take just enough to fill, just the tip of the brush, and do just one section at a time, let that soak in consistently, be wiping that so it's a nice, even, rather thin coat. I don't need to bathe the project in sanding sealer. So as with all things, it takes a bit more time and care and attention to do it that way, but I found that it definitely makes a difference in the results, again, especially when using a stain that might respond differently to that sanding sealer. And the other aspect of that plays into that is the brushes that I use. So you can see I've been demonstrating with this, and for a nice big broad surface like the back of this plate, I will use a nice big brush like this. I still just kind of work in sections and make sure to spread it all out as I go, and try to keep it from pooling in one spot. I'll spread it out and work in a nice even fashion. But I can work quickly and get this whole thing done in maybe one or two dips of the brush, and call that good. And again, as long as I'm being careful with kind of where the brush is, this isn't really too big to use on the edge here. But once I start looking at the edge of the plate, and especially the other side where there's all these little crevices, and I need to make sure that the sanding sealer gets down in all of the little points, and trying to get that even, then I switch to this small brush, kind of a detail brush that I can really make sure I get those bristles in there and all those fine crevices. I thought, hey, it's sanding sealer, it's really runny and liquid, and I can still use the big brush and it'll go a lot faster, and I can just brush it on there, it'll fall down, and if I don't get some, I'll just dip the brush again and really get it in there. But in that process, then I keep adding more sanding sealer, and I run into the issues that I was describing before. So even though, again, it adds quite a bit of time to the process of finishing, I have committed to using the small brush and really just working on small sections at a time. So as an example, just get the tip of the brush going, and I'll just, maybe I didn't get quite enough in there, but just work on this little section here, keep the brush moving, kind of dab it, and really being intentional to get the tip down in all those little pointy corners. And that's it. Just work on that a little bit at a time. And then I'll move on to this section, and I'm just going to stay inside that rim area there for the time being. I'm going to do that together all at one time. And so, as I said, this little brush helps make sure I can get inside and deposit the sanding sealer inside all the small chips that a design like this plate has. And you can see I'm doing just small sections, not trying to do too much at once. Once I see that the sealer is not really spreading out anymore, I'll go back to the can and replenish the brush. But I do try to spread out as much as I can. I'm not super liberal with the application because I don't want it pooling. I don't want it getting too concentrated in one area. So same thing, just kind of quickly brushing. And these chips on this text are particularly shallow, so I find that even though they're small, the sealer can kind of almost soak into those from the surface. They're so just shallow of a cut that even as it goes through the surface, it'll kind of leak in through the end grain there. So that doesn't take too long. Again, a lot faster or a lot slower than it would be with this, but continuing on, sometimes it can be actually more of a challenge in these areas with the bigger chips, because I kind of have to pay attention to them more one at a time. I end up actually having to paint the surfaces, the carved surface, the inside edge, with the brush. I can't just kind of paint over it like I could with those smaller chips. There's just so much surface area on these that I have to go into it. So I just kind of wanted to give a little insight on this process, again, based on the way that I do finishing, in case you do something similar or found other issues. Hopefully this is helpful. One additional thing that I will mention is I always pay attention to give some extra sanding attention, both before applying the sealer and after applying, before applying the stain, is I'll make sure to sand any end grain. So this surface here, as it curls up, it exposes some end grain, and the edge over here, and there's on the back as it scoops, it exposes end grain. So I'll make sure to sand those nice and smooth to prevent that end grain from absorbing too much stain. The grain of wood is kind of like straws, and the stain likes to really go inside those straws. As you expose the end grain, it exposes the opening, and it can really soak in. So you tend to get excess stain. It'll be darker in an area like that compared to here where it's along the grain. So paying extra attention, make sure those are nice and smooth to kind of close up some of that end grain to prevent the excess stain from soaking in. But yeah, so just to recap, taking the time and attention and care in finishing that you do to the carving itself to make sure that the finish complements and accentuates the carving work as much as possible. One way to do that is to use a consistent amount of stain everywhere, not letting it be too heavy or too thin in some places. And so to do that, using an appropriate size brush based on the surface that you're working on, whether it's carved or not, or big or small. So hope that's helpful in getting nice polished finishes for all your projects.